were we? So, we've now reduced or eliminated the problem of having to track vintages of marginal costs. We only need to focus on this optimal price. PT star is really the star of the show. Yeah? Alright, so now we can get to the New Keynesian Phillips curve. So we're going to do a couple more little exercises in algebra to help us. In the first one, we have here this optimal price adjustment from before, right, where we've eliminated this marginal cost dependency, so we brought the PD star we have over on the right-hand side. 6. Right, we've replaced this mt plus k t hat with our relation here. Right, we solve it again for this PT star, and we get, and that's why we now have this capital theta out in front. Right, we have essentially the same thing as before, the price adjustment, marginal costs in real terms, and this translates into the nominal marginal cost. And there's this, for us, when we think about the price today, perhaps that we want to choose, just in case we're stuck with it, k periods in the future, we're going to take into account how we think our costs are going to develop k periods in the future, and what we think the price level is going to be k periods in the future compared to today. Now, or compared to yesterday, this change in the price level compared to our baseline here. And we get this beautiful plus k, and we have it over here t minus 1. And the reason why I'm writing that p is kind of funny is it's sometimes hard to tell when I'm writing whether I'm writing a capital P or lowercase p. This is a lowercase p because it's the log of the price level. Yeah? And that log here, right, is really important. So I'm going to subtract the log price, pt plus k minus 1. Can I do that? Well, sure. But add it right back in. And if we look at this term here, it's the log price difference between period t plus k and t plus k minus 1. This is inflation. Now I'm going to add or subtract p t plus k minus 2. And that's fine, right? If I add it. And I'm going to continue to do this. And I end the last term. I add in here plus pt that I had before subtracted. they always came in these red and blue pairs. That's why I did that. I've color coordinated. Right, so you know when we get to the end, this last term here, we ended on the term that we used to correct the term before. So this is the same. Red, black, red, and blue is the same as just black. Yeah? These two expressions are the same. And so what we see here is that it's simply the sum of inflation rates between now and period t plus k. So a way to think about what this means intuitively, why this is obvious intuitively, right? If we say that the price of a good has increased by 10% over the period of 2 years. Well, this means that maybe it went up by 7% the first year and 3% the second year, right? Or maybe 3% the first year and 7% the second year, or 5% in both years. But the total price change is equal to the sum of the year-by-year inflation rates, at least here in this log perspective here. Yeah? That's the great thing about logs. You have this compounding effect here. Okay, so this is cool. Right? We use this effect, and there's some ways that we can rewrite this now as the optimal price adjustment is equal to our weighted average of expected current and future marginal costs in a term that depends on future, current and future inflation, expected inflation rates. And now what we do is we're going to deduce some of this. Remember I talked about the telescoping out of the Lagrangian? We write out the terms in the sum. We're going to do the same thing here to then come up with a new telescope. I'm going to write a variable. I'm going to write it as yt, or we're going to define the variable as equal to yt equals the sum from j to k. Let's not use y, let's use zt, 0 to infinity, of, so let me have to use delta k et xt plus k. This is equal to the first term, xt, plus delta et xt plus 1, plus delta 2 et xt plus 2, and so on. Let's compare this to zt plus 1. Well, that has to be equal to xt plus 1 plus I can cheat once or twice with a finger, but then it's easier and it doesn't work. Delta et plus 1 plus 1 xt plus 2 plus delta squared et plus 1 xt plus. And now let's think about today's perspective on zt plus 1. So our expectation today that's the expectation today of this. And we have, under the assumption of rational expectations with mathematical expectations, the law of iterated expectations should play a role here. So my expectation tomorrow of the day after tomorrow should be the same as my expectation today of the day after tomorrow. If it's not, kind of what I'm thinking is, well, today, I think in 2 days, the world's going to be, a happy place. But I expect tomorrow to be a very unhappy person, so I expect tomorrow to expect the day after tomorrow to be an unhappy place. We all have our struggles in life, so it's completely legitimate on an individual level. But that's kind of what's going on here. We're playing mind games with ourselves. It's not consistent. Right? And that's not just say, again, we all do this in these sorts of things. But for our model, if we use the law of rational expectations, this gives us then that ET ZT plus 1 is equal to ET XT plus 1 plus delta ET XT plus 2 plus delta squared ET XT plus 3, and so on. Right, there's a reason why I wrote them like this. You notice, those are the same terms, except for here, it's multiplied by delta, but here it's also missing just one delta, and we're missing this first term here. So we can now combine this and write that ZT is equal to XT plus delta Isn't that some crazy trickery? Look at that. We now took this infinite sum and we collapsed it into two terms. The value today, this xt today, and the expectation of the z term, so this expectation of itself in the future. This is how we can take these infinite sums and write them recursively. So what I've done here is I'm just taking out that first term in the sum, I'm just finding that xt here, and now we're going to notice that this term at the bottom here is the same as the term at the top, right? But we start with another 1. This power of delta. It was missing there. Right, so this is taking this. Right, so the isolation of the contemporaneous, the today's term, what I wrote is xt here, and the rest. And this rest, the rest we can rewrite in a way where we recognize it as exactly equal to beta theta times the original sum here. We rewrote this, it's the same thing as this here, it's the same as delta times our zt plus 1. Okay? So now we've collapsed these sums into 41. This whole forward pricing thing is, think about this. We don't have to think about all the entire future trajectory of the optimal prices or of the optimal marginal cost position, but rather we look at today's marginal cost position and the optimal price that we want, that we will set tomorrow. And this sums it all up. In essence, right, all of the future path of marginal cost can then be captured in our expectation of tomorrow's optimal price adjustment. So we've expressed this now recursively. We have our, remember the source of inflation, the size of the price adjustment, and the fraction of firms who are allowed to take this price adjustment. We can sum in here to get rid of this optimal price adjustment, and we write now our equation 42. The New Keynesian-Phillips curve, inflation depends on marginal cost deviations today, real marginal cost deviations today, and future expected inflation. In other words, if marginal costs are going up, this means firms are going to be raising their prices, right? That's going to be causing inflation today. Okay. We can solve this forward, and we see that this future inflation, expected inflation term, is capturing future expected marginal costs. Right? So all of the future drivers of inflation is forward-looking behavior. Firms who expect marginal costs to be higher in the future, who are in a position to change their prices today, will do so. Remember that front-loading behavior. So inflation is equal to the current expectation of all current and future marginal costs. Right, if you want to take the markup perspective, if firms expect markups to be below their steady state, right, their markups aren't high enough, they're not making as much profit as they should be, they're going to choose higher prices to realign to the frictionless markup. So in other words, we can rewrite our Phillips curve as current sources of inflation and then expectation future sources of inflation. That's what's driving everything here. And now we can look at a couple interpretations of parameters. Right? Some keeping everything else constant. Ceteris paribus, comparative statics, that's what we're looking for. Right, so let's think about the discount factor beta increasing. What would that mean? The higher is beta, the less impatient households are. Households are more willing to wait than before. Remember, if beta is equal to 1, our households are perfectly patient and they don't care, right, whether happiness comes today or in the future. They just want more happiness. So as beta increases, the owners of firms discount the future by less. They're less impatient. Right? So they're giving more weight with a higher beta to future events than they have been before. And part of the future events that they're looking at is the future stream of dividends from the profits that they get from firms. So as beta increases, firms' owners say, hey, pay attention to the future more because I care more about the future and I'm your owner. So firms do that. They put more weight to expected profits. Right? So you see this expectation term directly, beta goes up there. Right? But also here, in the weight on marginal cost, beta goes up, minus sign in front of here, lambda goes down. So we're going to see a shift in the New Keynesian-Phillips curve, more focus on expected inflation, future inflation, less on marginal costs. Another straightforward one for us is price rigidity, theta. So an increase in price rigidity. What does that mean? So if I change my price today, it's more likely that I'm going to be stuck with that price for a long period of time. Which means when choosing this price increase today, I should think more about the future than I had before. As theta goes up, the future should become more important. And we see that indeed here, when theta goes up, this goes up, minus sign in front of it, this goes up, minus sign in front of it. Here it's in the denominator, so it affects lambda negative. So all three thetas here move lambda down. Okay. So firms weigh less, put less emphasis on MC. So relative to before, they're going to place more emphasis on this future term, this expected inflation term. But you can also dig into theta, that's not so important here, the capital theta. That look at these working a little bit more. But for us, it's really this beta and theta, Gesundheit, that are giving us the insight here. All right, so this is also very interesting. In a classical model, like if we add look at the monetary components of, say, a real business cycle model, inflation is going to come about from changes in the price level caused by monetary policy, taking the real allocation as given. But it doesn't really tell us how these price changes occur, where inflation comes from. It just prices have to move, otherwise we're out of equilibrium. Okay? Right? I'm a macroeconomist. I accept the power of equilibrium a lot, but it's kind of disappointing. Right? Prices must go up, otherwise, right, with this, we have this example in the first exercise. So if we have expansionary monetary policy, what could adjust to lead us to this long run equilibrium of output going back to its natural level? If you go back to exercise one of the stories that was given was, well, maybe prices change, right? So prices have to adjust and they have to go up, right? Which then decreases real balances, which brings output back down. Okay, but how do prices go up? Like, who's changing these prices and why? No account of that. But the new Keynesian model, we see, or at least gives us a consistent, coherent description of where these price changes might be coming from. Right? We have actual firms optimizing, choosing their prices because they have some market power, so they have the ability to set their own prices, right? But they're facing, they're in an imperfect situation because they have these nominal rigidities. They're not allowed to change their prices every single period. So this gives them a forward-looking component of their decision-making process. And so we see that inflation, right, results from these forward-looking price-setting decisions of profit-maximizing firms. All right, now the connection to marginal cost makes sense from the pricing perspective, but in terms of the macro perspective, we'd like to relate this to output. Again, like we saw the IS curve already snuck in there, right? Y and I related together. Let's see if we can replace MC with Y. And sure, if we can, marginal cost. Right, the marginal cost is the real wage divided by the marginal product of labor. In log terms, right, we can write it out like this. And if we just substitute in first order condition of our household for the labor leisure supply, right, and we have the marginal product of labor from the aggregate production function, we get to equation 45. Right, now, importantly, this relation of marginal cost to output, independent of any type of price setting. We have to talk about that. And so now we can think about this natural level concept that I just mentioned a minute ago, that we looked at together in exercise 1, kind of thinking ahead when we were in the ISLM model. So what would we have in a long run equilibrium under flexible prices? After all price adjustment has taken place, if there's a shock, eventually every firm gets tapped by the cowboys. What they're going to do in a world where this has happened, the place where this equilibrium is going to, we can determine by the condition that we had that the marginal cost, which is determined here, has to be a constant. And it has to be, real marginal cost has to be a constant and related to this markup. Right? Remember, long run, and flexible world, we have a constant markup in the steady state, the inverse of M. All right, so on the left-hand side, we're going to set our marginal cost equal to this constant. All right, so now, on the right-hand side, what do we have? Well, we have output, and we have the technology shock. Oh, So this is determining implicitly the level of output that is consistent with marginal costs being at their long run level, i.e. with a natural level of output. This is the level of output under flexible prices, when prices always adjust to ensure we have a constant markup. And this gives us equation 46. So it's natural rate of output depends on some constant and the technology process. Right, so if we look first at this, so the technology process, what we see, if productivity goes up, if AG goes up, if technology goes up, we're going to be producing more, right? That should be, that goes through, that makes sense. What we intuitively expect actually holds. And there's some constant level, right? So even if technology is at this at steady state level or some constant level, we have a level of production here that's positive. But what's interesting here is the effect of mu. If mu goes down, let's find where we had mu.
Marginal cost.
Right, so mu. Yeah, so mu, oh, here we go. Going backwards. Mu is the log of the markup. So if mu goes up, the markup is going up. The markup going up means epsilon is going down. Right? So this means we're moving closer to a world where Apple is the norm and not the exception. Less competition. Less competition, mu going up, minus is going to reduce output. Right? So we see the effect of competitiveness, or the lack thereof, even when prices fully adjust. As long as the markup is not 1, so as long as firms charge a higher price than their marginal cost, then output is lower than what it otherwise would be. Right, so this market power of firms lowers output relative to perfect competition. Right, so we have already here a way in for policy. Right? Policy can improve on the market. And this is an important thing to keep in mind in macro. We see a lot, or I think in economics in general. On the one hand, you'll see, there's lots of markets can be very useful and very powerful, and there's a lot of conviction in the usefulness of markets. But at the same time, right, markets rarely are perfect. And whenever there's not perfect, right, there's a trade-off. Simply being letting these firms do whatever they want and not intervening might not be the best idea. There might be reason here for fiscal policy or a antitrust or competitiveness authority in a country to try to reduce monopoly power. And you see this on a big scale between Europe and the United States. The EU has been increasingly imposing sanctions on US companies like Google and Apple and Facebook for violating fair competition rules in Europe. Apple, Google, and some of these large American tech companies, they have a large amount of market power, and they can, flex this market power muscle. So why do we want to stop them? It's not because Europe is mad at Trump. Maybe Europe is, but the point is, it's inefficient. Output is lower than under perfect competition. We all have less stuff because we're giving lots of our profits to Apple. And worse than that, it's not that we're giving it to them 1 for 1. To give Apple 10 cents, we're giving up $1. Right? So it's not even like, it's a pretty rough deal. Right, so that's what we get inroad for policy with mu here. But that's not monetary policy. Monetary policy usually doesn't adjust or doesn't get involved in competition between firms. We're going to keep heading towards the goal of monetary policy. All right, now we can relate our marginal cost deviation from the constant level. Right? The constant level is the same thing as related to this natural level of output. So we can relate this to a measure of output, y tilde, that tells us how output differs from its natural level. Right? Is output higher? Y tilde is positive. This means output now is higher than it would be in the case of flexible prices. And so what does that mean? If we're producing more than it would in the case of flexible prices, it probably tells us that many firms would like to raise their prices or would want to raise their prices to reduce demand that they're facing, but they're not able to adjust their prices, so we're producing more than we would if firms were able to adjust and hence, under my assumption, increase their prices. So we're going to think in terms of not just like the level of output, but the gap. This is the concept that's used for the gap to what we would have in the case of flexible prices. So what is the impact of this price rigidity? What is the consequence of not allowing every firm to adjust its price every period on the level of output? Right, so this gives us then the New Keynesian Phillips curve with the output gap perspective. Inflation and the output gap. So a lot of the same interpretation we had before, right? The lambda marginal cost, we just now have this relation between marginal cost and the output gap to this combination of parameters. And now we can think of this more from like a political commentary perspective. If output is, if the economy is overheating, would be a term that people use. If we're growing more quickly than our economy can sustain, i.e. if we have a positive output gap, this is going to tend to drive prices up. There's going to be excess pressure on firms. Right? And these firms can't keep up with this increase in demand in terms of their production. So as a consequence, something has to give, and it's going to be prices moving up. If our economy is in recession, so if we're in a slump, if we're producing less than we otherwise would, right? If we're growing less than right, our productive capacity is growing, then right, we have less demand. Right? When in a recession, firms are not selling as much as they could be selling based on their productive capacity. So in order to right, clear inventory, right, or in the face of this lower demand, they're going to be cutting prices. So we're going to see inflation here, according to the output, according to the New Keynesian Phillips curve, positively correlated with the output gap. Hyperinflation can also be happening for another reason. And this is also sort of a warning, or also an explanation of why the Phillips curve broke apart after the 1970s. We looked at this briefly last week. So output and unemployment. We can think of output gap as being related to unemployment. If we're producing more than we would in this long run, this means we need to hire more people. People need to work overtime. Right? We're going to be driving unemployment down to an absolute minimum. Right? If we're producing less than we would in a flexible price world, if we're not on our trend output level, right, then right, our production is lower than our productive capacity, so we're going to start letting people go, firing people, having people work fewer hours. So we get then here the same negative correlation between inflation and unemployment you would see in older or in the original Phillips curve. But now we also see what might have been the culprit for inflation running haywire in the 1970s, without any substantial increase in the unemployment or output gap to explain it. And that's this expectations component. Inflation can also be higher simply because we think inflation is going to be higher in the future. That's enough. Well, why? Remember, if I'm a firm today and I'm able to choose my price, I might not be able to choose my price again tomorrow. So I'm going to have to set my price today based on what I expect, what I think is going to happen in the future. And if I think that inflation is going to be higher in the future, I'd better increase my price today, because I might not be able to tomorrow. So expectations of increases in future inflation can drive inflation today. And again, back to points of credibility of monetary policy, inflation or expectations management, and central bank communication. You look at almost every country, and the communication done by the central bank has now become even very calculated, very careful. Right? Why? If a central banker, says something and it's reported in the media, people are worried, what does this mean? What does this mean for monetary policy? Does this mean they're going to be increasing the inflation or the interest rate next quarter or not? Are they really going to do that with the exchange rate? Oh, I think this is going to cause more inflation in the future. Right? And if enough people believe that, then it does. It causes that inflation now. So this is also the danger. We're going to see this then when we solve this model tomorrow. The problems of self-confirming beliefs. So I think inflation is going to be higher. If we all think inflation is going to be higher, what do? Well, for firms, we're going to raise our prices. So what happens to inflation? It's higher. So were we right? Yeah. Was there any underlying cause? There doesn't have to be. Right? That's the frightening thing. Inflation can go up simply because people believe it will go up. And that's self-consistent. Monetary policy is well advised to keep close track of inflation expectations and make sure, as the term goes, that they're well anchored. All right, we can take our Euler equation and rewrite it in terms of the output gap. And what we're going to see here is we're going to get then the output gap is related to the real interest rate relative now to our preference-based neutral or natural rate of interest, which is just based on rho, right, our level of impatience, but also on to the natural rate of interest that is going to be changing based on productivity. In very productive times, if we have growth in productivity, we're going to have a natural rate of interest that's higher. In other words, you can think of this like, one reason not to save is because you expect your income to be growing anyway. So, I should be saving more than you simply because we're at different stages in our lives. I'm at the point in my life, I feel old saying this, right, where I don't think my income's going to go up much anymore. Yeah? My natural rate of interest has fallen. Yeah? The growth rate of my natural income, or my natural output, has fallen to about 0. Yeah? So now, the interest rate that I compare to when making my consumption savings decision is simply my own impatience. For you, it's different. Right? When we save, we save, we give up now, so we reduce our consumption now to have more in the future. Right? But your income trajectory is already skewed. Your income now is lower than it's going to be in the future. You already have sort of this natural gradient of just waiting doing your education, getting your, just waiting is going to give you higher income. So why would you want to give up even more today to get the relative, your comparison, your baseline is based on the growth in your income that you're already going to be facing. Right? So this is the fact that you are looking ahead to seeing a growth in your income means to get you to incentivize to save even more, you would have to be offered a real interest rate that exceeds this even higher threshold. Right? In other words, I'm trying to give you an explanation for why it's not only okay, because it's your preference, right? Or there might be other reasons why you can't. You might be credit constrained or this or that. But it's not only okay, but maybe it's even optimal that you're not saving, or saving as much as sometimes you think you should. Right? This model tells you that your natural rate of interest is higher because of your expectations of future income growth. Now, don't get me in trouble by right. It's one model, different perspectives, or a suite of models for understanding. Right? That's the disclaimer that's course started off, but that's one way to think about this, at least intuitively. It's coming from the IS equation. All right, we can do this same, right? It's a recursive equation. Output gap today, output gap today in the future. Right? We can solve this forward, like we did with the New Keynes and Phillips curve, and we get that the output gap today. This depends on the sum of future and current deviations of the real interest rate from this natural level. And this gives us then the insight for monetary policy, right? Just like the IS equation. If monetary policy is able to affect the real interest rate, right, then this means that current and expected policy actions affect aggregate demand. And this observation is what motivated a lot of things that central banks did after the financial crisis, during the European debt crisis, and also during the COVID crisis. We can lower our interest rates to zero, the nominal interest rate, but then we can't lower them anymore. What other options do we have? Maybe we can make promises about the future, forward guidance, or other forms of unconventional monetary policy. Get longer term real interest rates down lower. We're talking about inflation targets, changing them to maybe lower expected or increase future expected inflation, which would lower real interest rates. Just a quick question. Why do we think that the nominal interest rate can't be negative? Why do we think of zero as the lowest that the nominal interest rate can be? Have you thought about that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The German bond.
So yeah, there's the Bund, right, is like the lowest in Europe, right? Yeah. But in terms of well, why can't then the German government, the ECB, lower the interest rate lower than that? Lower the interest rate even further. Why can't the return of the Bund fall to zero or become negative?
I have about that because it happened during the crisis.
Yeah.
And people didn't believe in government bond anymore.
Yeah, so it did happen, and that's why this is very important to understand. So we'll think about why it happened. So one alternative. So if you have a negative interest rate,
when you put money there, you have to kind of earn interest, but you have to pay
Yeah.
to keep your money there. So I think it's nonsense. So it's
And then- so okay, let me slow this down. So you're saying it's nonsense because you give the bank money and you have to pay them to keep it there. So essentially, this is what happens: is if we have a negative interest rate, right? I give the bank my money, and a year later, they give me back this, right? I mean, money loses its value for inflation, but this seems like robbery. I gave you this, and you give me back this. Yeah? Why do you think, or why should we think that this is nonsense? Can you think of an arbitrage example, what's the alternative to giving this to the bank? There. And a year from now,
I'm not sure.
I pull it back out. I can just hold cash. The interest rate on cash is 0%. So that's the alternative. I give the bank my money, and they give me less back in a year, so negative interest rate, or I just hold the cash. And if you can always hold cash unless it's illegal, there's some places where there's restrictions and the like, but otherwise, this means the inflation rate, or the interest rate, I'm sorry, should never be negative. But it did become negative in some places. Can you think of, so you and I, we don't have access to enough resources for holding a lot of cash to be a problem. Let's say I'm, I don't know, Apple. And instead of keeping money in the bank, I want to keep cash. How much cash does Apple have that it deals with that it has in bank accounts? Are we talking about $1,000? No. $1 million? Like $20 billion? Do you know how much money that is? Like where do you keep it? My pocket's not big enough, unfortunately, for $20 billion. So there the arbitrage argument falls apart because you can't just hold it in cash. Right? So you're willing to accept a small negative interest rate because that is cheaper than the actual alternative, which would be, what would be the physical alternative to a pocket, but a pocket that can hold, well, I don't know, $20 billion that you don't want anyone to be able to rob from. I don't know, like, think of a building with security guards and guns, and that costs something. So if I just give the bank a negative interest rate, that might be cheaper than hiring a security force and building a vault and the like.
So you mean like only in the case of a very large amount of money, then a very small
Negative.
amount negative.
Yeah. And so
Interest
that's,
rate can be still make sense.
yeah, and that's the thought process that we had to go through in 2008, because before that, we always talked about the zero lower bound of nominal interest rates, and then things went below that zero bound, and so we call it the effective lower bound. There's some lower amounts of interest rates that you can accept. Another alternative, another good example, the first country in Europe that had a negative interest rate was Denmark. And the reason why the ECB's interest rate had gone down to zero, or just about zero, and the Danish, and there was concerns because of Greece and people in Germany were getting upset that the euro might break apart. This means holding the euro became riskier, right? If you hold a currency and it falls apart, then, right, what happens to it? What is it worth? So people started to buy lots of bonds or putting their money in banks in Denmark. Why? The Danish currency has a fixed exchange rate to the euro. It's part of the European area, part of the European system of central banks, but they still have their own different currency that's printed differently. And the thinking was, if there is a crisis with the euro, if the euro does break apart, then if my money is in the kroner in Denmark, the Danes will leave and start their own economy, and my money is safe. If nothing happens to the euro, then they'll maintain the exchange rate to the euro, and then it's just as good as keeping it in the euro. So you had insurance against a collapse of the of the euro by keeping your money in Denmark and the Danish crown. And people are willing to pay for insurance. We all pay for insurance. And so even banks and the like were paying for insurance by accepting them a negative interest rate in Denmark. They drove the interest rate down. All right, but so what we see here, right, so this unconventional monetary policy can be effective directly here in the new Keynesian IS. All right, so to close the model, right, we have our Phillips curve that's going to relate the how prices adjust over time. We have an IS curve, so now we just need an LM or a TR curve. Right, we need to describe monetary policy. Otherwise, it's the same as the qualitative models that you've seen and worked through before in economics. Okay. So we're going to look at both control of the money supply or of liquidity and control of the nominal interest rate. So if we start off with a Taylor rule, like equation 51, we have monetary policy sum nominal interest rate equal to this underlying natural rate based on our preferences, our rate of time preference in rho, plus a response to inflation and the output gap, and a monetary policy shock. And so one after another. Right? So this tells us if everything's in equilibrium, the nominal interest rate is going to be equal to the return that we would get in a, right, or it's going to be equivalent to our impatience. Right? So the return that we would get in a zero inflation steady state where we're surrounding ourselves with. This term tells us that if inflation turns out to be higher than zero in this steady state or target rate, then the central bank is going to raise the nominal interest rate. Contractionary monetary policy to manage inflation. We saw this as the observation empirically of John Taylor, which is what motivated this rule. Right? And here we have the stabilizing idea here. So think of firms being concerned about inflation, driving inflation up. This would cause automatically the central bank, under the Rule 51, to raise the nominal interest rate, right, which would depress demand for goods, right, which would reduce pressure on prices. The response on the output gap gives us some sense of monetary policy contributing to stabilizing the real economy. Right? Since the central bank and its decisions also affect the real economy through sticky prices, then if the economy is in a recession, if the output gap is negative, the central bank would lower the nominal interest rate, expansionary monetary policy, which would boost the economy in the recession. Right, just like in standard IS, LMTR. And then we have a monetary policy shock. Right? You can think of this as just a mechanical device to see what unexpected changes in the nominal interest rate can do. We can also think of this as being some measure of maybe mismeasurement. Maybe the central bank makes a mistake in measuring the output gap. Right? Output gap is hard to measure, especially in this model. Why? The output gap is the measure between actual output and the level of output that we would have in the absence of sticky prices. This is a very hypothetical thing. We don't observe what output would be like if all prices could adjust instantaneously. That's not something that we can observe in the economy. We can measure things of confidence in the economy. So since this Yn is a difficult concept, right, no matter how good of a job we do at measuring actual output, we're going to have a hard time measuring output gap perfectly. So this would tend to add in some measurement error, right? And this measurement error we could think of as coming into this shock new. Or maybe it's a monetary policy mistake. Right? Maybe the central bank follows this rule most of the time, but sometimes either they weren't doing their jobs or they were scared. Right? Maybe Donald Trump has been trying to get Jerome Powell to do a big mu. Right? Jerome Powell, the head of the Federal Reserve, has been getting a lot of critique, taking a lot of pressure from Donald Trump, because Donald Trump thinks that the interest rate should be lower. Not that it should be. And it's, you know, it's hard if you're being bullied by the President of the United States. Yeah? Right, so it's happened in the past too. If you look back in the 1970s, we can think in the political cycle, if it's the year before an election, a president who's up for re-election would really like the economy to be doing well, because then he or she can take credit for it. You know? So this would be a good time for there to be a surprise drop in nominal interest rates. You know? Beep, beep, beep. Hello, Jerome Powell, I'm up for re-election, lower the interest rate, boost the economy, right? And exactly that phone call happened with Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon, they weren't aware of this. This was a big scandal for a while, but they were recording a lot of the conversations in the White House for like memoirs or archival purposes, right? And there ended up being, recordings of him calling then, was it Arthur Burns, Macheezy, and putting pressure on them to lower the interest rates for political reasons. One, because of elections, and also there was U.S. involvement here in Vietnam at the time where things were not going well for the United States, and that was part of the political response to make things, if we make the economy go better at home, then Americans might stop protesting or being upset about our involvement in Vietnam. That would also be a new monetary policy shock, some reason, mismeasurement, political pressure, right, that makes I deviate from this rule that the central bank otherwise wants to hold. Okay. Now we can put these parts, or combine these three equations. So we put equation 51 into the IS equation here. We can write the system, the entire model, in terms of two equations, and the output gap and inflation, expected output gap and inflation, and this shock here. And we are going to take a picture of this. Thanks. So let's think of a model that's written in terms of a scalar. Like this. So this is going to be exogenous. And we wanted to notice with this model, we can solve it forward. So take this equation, lag it forward one period, and then take conditional expectations at time t. Plug this in, we get then xt equals a squared dt xt plus 2 plus dzt plus d times a et zt plus 1. Now write this again for one more period in the future. Xt plus 2 equals a t xt plus 3 plus d et z t plus 2. Plug that in there. And we get xt equals a cubed times et xt plus 3 plus dzt plus da et zt plus 1 plus dA squared et zt plus 2. Now let's do, remember I told you the joke about the mathematicians conference and the bartender who put 2 beers on the counter because we had these mathematicians who were doing the infinite series. And the bartender did pattern recognition. He saw, aha, 1 plus 1/2 plus 1/4 plus 1/8, this must be equal to 2. We have to do something similar here with exactly a very similar object. We need to do pattern recognition now with our geometric series. So if I just went out one period, I have a to the power of 1. If I go out to x2, another period, I have a to the power of 2. If I go to another period, it's t plus 3, a to the power of 3. So let's go out k periods, xt plus k. So it must be then a to the power of k. Yeah, you got it. Put those 2 beers on the counter. Perfect. All right. And we went to z t plus 0 when we had, to the power of, we went 1 period forward. Here when we went 2 period, it was 2 minus 1, 1. 3 periods, we went out to 2, which was 3 minus 1. So out to k minus 1, as you said. So this must be then d times the sum of j equals, we start to 0 and go to k minus 1 of, we always are matching the power of a and the plus in z. So a to the power of j, e t z t plus j. Now just for a moment, we'll come back to this, and we'll see that this doesn't make much of a difference. Let's assume for a moment independent across time. So et of zt plus j is equal to 0 for all j not equal to 0. In that case, this would become then xt equals a to the power of k et xt plus k plus d zt. And now, instead of going out k periods, let's go out an infinite number of periods. Let's put those 2 beers on the countertops, like the bartender did. Okay, so xt equals, and the limit, as k goes to infinity, of ak et xt plus k plus d times zt. If a is less than 1 absolute value, then something fantastic is going to happen here with this limit. If a is equal to 1/2, then a squared is 1/8, a cubed is 1/16, a to the infinity is 0. So this then collapses to xt equals d zt. Or in the more general case, it also is just going to depend. We take the limit here. We will simply have d times the limit j equals 0 infinity aj et zt plus j if the absolute value of a is less than 1. Now, if the absolute value of a is greater than 1, then we can't write it like this. We can't solve the model forward. Right, and we'd be stuck with a representation. So if absolute a is greater than 1, right, we can write this model as xt equals a times xt plus 1 plus a times mean 0 expectation shock plus dzt. Right, and we can then move this back up here, we can write this as xt equals 1 over a xt minus 1 minus d over a zt minus 1 minus maybe one of our does. Probably more useful to write this as a minus. It's just a definition thing. And so here, when we've used the definition that the expectation of a variable next here is equal to its actual value plus a minus a forecasting error. So if we're using rational expectations, if we're using statistical expectations, on average we're going to be right, but in any given period, our expectation is going to be off by some expectations error. And now we have a difficult situation, namely that we have nothing to pin down this expectation. It's a belief shock. Remember, we can have something like, if we believe inflation is going to be higher, we all raise our prices, so inflation is higher. Well, it's self-confirming, self-referential. So it has nothing to do with ZT, whatever the exogenous factor is in the model. It's non-fundamental. So this would be a belief. God, I can't spell anymore. It's too late. Belief. Shock. A bubble. Non-fundamental. Or a sunspot shock. There are many different words that people have for this sort of exogenous process. It's simply a process that is unrelated to any part of the model, right? Unpredictable. So imagine, right, the next call, right? Oh, it's Christina Lagarde, and she's asking what inflation is going to be, and my answer is whatever you believe it to be. This is difficult for what are we supposed to do? This means we can't predict anything conclusively. So this parameter, this one number a, is really important. That's different in this case. In this case, if a is less than 1, we have an exact prediction. xt equals d zt. Right? And you notice there's a case where that will come out if, right, if this epsilon t plus 1 is equal to xt, right, this will collapse, and we get that fundamental solution. We get this more complicated solution, right? This belief shock would have to be consistent with would be related to this underlying z process. Right? Would be adapted to the stochastics of the z process. But if a is greater than 1 in absolute value, that doesn't have to be the case. And tomorrow we're going to solve our model. We're going to make the jump on how do we do this algebra if instead of a single variable we have vectors and matrices. That can be a little complicated at first glance. All we want to keep track of, though, is how we can measure something like a inside or outside the unit circle, less than 1 in absolute value, greater than 1 in absolute value. And we're going to see how this is actually related directly to monetary policy. So it's exactly Christina Lagarde who determines whether or not we can have these self-referential inflation bubbles or not. And if that's not a great place to end, motivated to come back tomorrow to now apply this new Keynesian model and see what monetary policy can do, I don't know what else to do. So I'll see you tomorrow and take a look. As I said, like the pricing equation a little bit, that'd be helpful. Well, and also for those of you who came a little bit late, we started to look at. I added onto the e-learning platform instructions for MATLAB online and Dynair. MATLAB online, you can use 30 hours a week for free. So as long as you register, and if you have a trial version, you probably already are registered. So we can do here, for this course, 30 hours will be more than enough. And then you've got 30 hours every month from now on, hopefully that you can use MATLAB. And so we can look at some Dynair files tomorrow together, hopefully, too. So until then, goodbye, and I'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you.
That's